Want to know what happened? Watch the video.
Dark rivers, frozen forests, a land divided between merchants and raiders, tribes and conquerors. In the 9th century, the Vikings, those feared lords of the sea, turned their gaze eastward toward the Slavs. What followed was not just trade, it was not just exploration, it was blood, brutality, entire villages reduced to ashes, families torn apart by the iron grip of slavery, and stories whispered across centuries of unrelenting violence. But why did the Vikings unleash such savagery against the Slavs? And how did this brutality shape the rise of one of history's most mysterious medieval empires? Stay with me until the end, because the answer is darker and more twisted than you might expect. To understand this brutality, we must first set the stage. Picture the lands of Eastern Europe in the 800s. Vast forests stretch beyond sight. Rivers like the Volga and Dnieper carve paths that connect worlds. The Baltic to the Black Sea, Scandinavia to Byzantium. Here, Slavic tribes live in wooden villages bound by kinship and pagan gods. But beyond the horizon, sails appear. Longships glide silently along the rivers. They carry men whose reputation has already terrorized the British Isles and Frankish coasts. These are not just raiders, they are opportunists, merchants, mercenaries. Yet when Vikings met the Slavs, the first contacts were not gentle handshakes. They were fire and steel. And soon a brutal partnership emerged, one of conquest, submission, and survival. But this uneasy relationship was about to turn into something even darker. The Slavs became more than neighbors, they became prey. Viking raiders struck settlements with ruthless efficiency. Villages along the rivers were easy targets, undefended, isolated, and ripe for plunder. But it wasn't just wealth the Vikings wanted, it was people. Slavic men, women, and children were dragged from their homes, chained, and forced into the slave markets of the East. Some were sold in Byzantium. Others were shipped as far as Baghdad, part of a vast human trade that enriched the Norse warlords. Imagine the terror. A midnight raid, shouts piercing the still night, screams echoing against the trees, doors splintering under axes, fires crackling as homes collapsed into embers, families separated forever, fathers cut down where they stood, mothers begging for mercy, children dragged into darkness, a child never seeing her mother again, a husband never returning from the fields. The silence after, heavier than the violence itself. And still, even in the face of such relentless cruelty, the Slavs endured. They rebuilt from ashes, buried their dead, and whispered vows of vengeance. They resisted in small acts, ambushes in forests, fortifications by rivers, defiance in the shadow of fear. But this was only the beginning. The raids were not isolated flashes of brutality. They were preludes, rehearsals for something greater, something far more devastating. The Vikings were preparing to unleash campaigns so vast, so catastrophic, that they would not just scar villages, they would scar entire regions. The worst was yet to come, because the Vikings were about to launch a series of campaigns that would shake the Slavic world to its core. In 913, Viking warbands, known as the Rus, embarked on one of the most savage expeditions of the early Middle Ages. Sailing from the rivers of the Slavic lands, they poured into the Caspian Sea like a tide of death. Chroniclers describe villages along the shores being obliterated, men slaughtered without mercy, women carried away in chains. The Russes raided not once, but repeatedly, in 913, 943, and beyond. Each time, the same pattern unfolded: burning, pillaging, enslaving. The brutality was so immense that entire regions were depopulated. Imagine it. Fishing villages where nets once filled with life, reduced to cinders. Trade towns echoing with silence where laughter once rang. Survivors fled into forests, carrying only the clothes on their backs, praying the wolves found them before the raiders did. The rivers that once carried trade now carried stories of horror, of warriors who descended like wolves and vanished just as quickly. Even distant rulers heard of the savagery. The Islamic geographers who chronicled these events painted the Ruses as both traitors and monsters, capable of great wealth, yet drenched in blood. And for the Slavs caught in their wake, survival meant submission or destruction. Some tribes were forced into alliances with the Rus, feeding their armies with provisions and captives. Others simply vanished from the chronicles, their names extinguished alongside their homes. Yet this wave of violence was not blind chaos. It was part of a calculated rise to power, a grim strategy to seize control of the river routes that linked Scandinavia to Persia and Byzantium. The Russes were not just raiders, they were empire builders, and their appetite for conquest was about to turn against another ancient rival, one whose fall would forever change the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The Khazars had long dominated the trade routes between East and West. For the Vikings, the Khazar Empire stood as both obstacle and opportunity. By the 10th century, the Rus, a Viking elite ruling over Slavic subjects, launched campaigns against the Khazars. The wars were devastating. Slavic tribes, already weakened by raids, were drawn into this clash of empires. Towns were razed, populations displaced. The old balance of power collapsed, and in its place, a new order emerged, the Kievan Rus. But behind the grandeur of this rising state lay a foundation built on blood. The Slavs, whose villages had been torched and whose people had been enslaved, now lived under Viking princes who ruled with iron fists. And this raises a chilling question. Were the Slavs partners in empire building, or merely victims of it? Here lies the paradox. The same Vikings who raided Slavic lands also married into Slavic families, adopted Slavic customs, and even took Slavic languages into their courts. Rurik, the legendary Norse founder of Rus, established a dynasty that fused Norse and Slavic bloodlines. Over time, Viking princes ruled from wooden fortresses in Novgorod and Kiev, surrounded by Slavic advisors, priests, and warriors. Markets bustled with goods from distant Byzantium, Baghdad, and the Baltic. Slowly, a hybrid culture was born, neither fully Norse nor fully Slavic, but something entirely new. And yet, integration did not erase the brutality. Instead, it masked it. Beneath the surface of alliances and dynasties, the scars of enslavement and destruction remained. Entire generations lived under rulers whose ancestors had once burned their homes. The memory of raids lingered in songs, in whispered warnings, in the names of rivers once stained red. For many Slavs, this duality was inescapable. Their new rulers might share their language and faith, but their power had been forged through fire and chains. It was a reminder that empire was not born from harmony, it was born from conquest. And yet, the story doesn't end here. Because just as the Vikings tried to consolidate power, darker tales of atrocities and massacres still haunted the land. Behind the facade of unity and statehood, violence still simmered, ready to erupt in ways that would remind the Slavs that the shadow of the longship had not truly disappeared. Consider the chronicles of Eastern Slavic monks. They describe raids where villages were left in ashes, where entire communities were dragged away in chains. In one chilling account, Viking raiders burned captives alive as warnings to others. These were not isolated events. They were patterns of dominance. Psychological warfare meant to terrify as much as to conquer. Picture the scene, the silence after a raid, the smell of smoke, the emptiness of fields once alive with families. For the Slavs, Viking brutality was not history, it was daily life. But the Slavs were not passive victims. Slowly, they began to resist. And that resistance would shape the next chapter in this brutal saga. Slavic tribes were not passive victims of the Viking tide. They learned to adapt, to endure, and to strike back. Across the river valleys and forests, wooden fortresses rose like thorns along the arteries of trade. Watchtowers and palisades stood guard over villages, their smoke signals warning of longships drifting in from the horizon. Slavic warriors rallied together, often from rival clans, united in the desperate cause of survival. Ironically, some Slavic leaders even turned to Vikings themselves, hiring raiders as mercenaries to fend off other Viking bands. Yesterday's predator became today's protector, if only for the right price. This uneasy pragmatism revealed the shifting sands of early medieval politics. Loyalty was rarely permanent, and alliances often dissolved as quickly as they formed. A new force soon entered the struggle: Christianity. With baptism came not just faith, but allies. The Slavs found in Byzantium and occasionally in the Frankish kingdoms partners willing to support them against pagan raiders. cross and sword became intertwined, forging a sense of unity that transcended tribe. Still, resistance carried a heavy cost. For every Viking warband driven off, fields lay smoldering, villages emptied, families shattered. The scars of these battles ran deeper than flesh. They carved themselves into memory and story, shaping the identity of a people. Yet, from this crucible of fire and loss came resilience. The Slavs were no longer prey. They had learned to endure, to fight, and to remember. Out of struggle was born a legacy of defiance, one that would echo through Eastern Europe for centuries. The brutality of the Viking Age left scars that never fully healed across the Slavic world. Villages burned, families torn apart, countless men, women, and children carried away in chains. Yet from this crucible of violence emerged something enduring. The raids, for all their cruelty, pushed the Slavic tribes toward unity. Out of chaos and captivity rose the Kievan Rus, a state that bore the imprint of both Norse ferocity and Slavic resilience. The Rus, princes, adopted the Viking instinct for war and conquest, but tempered it with Slavic endurance and adaptability. Trade along the great rivers flourished under their watch. Cities such as Novgorod and Kiev rose as hubs of wealth and power, tying the northern forests to the markets of Byzantium and beyond. From bloodshed came dynasties, law codes, and the beginnings of civilization in Eastern Europe. Yet the shadow of violence never disappeared. The very word slave, in English derived from Slav, stands as a grim linguistic monument to centuries of suffering. For generations, Slavic identity was inseparable from the memory of capture and bondage. It was not only their land and wealth that were plundered, but their very lives. And though the Norse themselves would eventually fade into the societies they once raided, intermarrying, converting, dissolving into the fabric of the Rus, their legacy lingered. It was a legacy of ambition and brutality, of building through destruction. So what are we left with? Were the Vikings accidental architects of Eastern European statehood, or simply destroyers who left behind a civilization built from the rubble? The answer perhaps is both. The truth, as always, lies in contradiction. The Vikings brought brutality, enslavement, and terror to the Slavs. But they also forged states, opened trade routes, and reshaped the destiny of Eastern Europe. History remembers the longships and the swords, but it also remembers the villages that burned, the families torn apart, and the whispered stories of cruelty that outlived the men who committed them. If this story has gripped you, remember, there are countless more tales of brutality, betrayal, and blood waiting in the shadows of history. So if you want to keep uncovering the dark mysteries of the past, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss the next descent into forgotten violence and scandal. And when you're ready, watch the next video now appearing on your screen. Because the story of history's darkest chapters never truly ends. It only waits for someone brave enough to uncover it.